So, welcome tonight to Year-Round Stewardship. My name is Terry Mathis, and I'm the Senior Program Director at the Episcopal Church Foundation. And it is my very great pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, Chris Harris. Chris is Canon for Congregational Development at St. Paul's Cathedral in San Diego. And what you'll see from his presentation tonight is that this means he not only oversees the income requirements of the cathedral, but the work of incorporating new members and connecting their gifts and passions with the life of the church. Before joining the staff of St. Paul's, Chris was a tax attorney, and I think you're going to hear some pretty good stories from those days in his life. His passion is helping people integrate their faith and a sense of call into all aspects of their life. That's the workplace, finance, relationships, all while designing a life of purpose and mission. Chris has spoken to congregations, diocesan gatherings, and college classes, and he's served on numerous boards, including the Alpha Project for the Homeless, which was designated the 185th Point of Light by the President of the United States. I think you'll see tonight that Chris is indeed one of the bright lights in the Episcopal Church, and we at ECF are happy to be working with him. So welcome, Chris. Now, having introduced Chris, it is a clause in my contract that I need to introduce the Episcopal Church Foundation, which is the host organization for tonight's webinar. ECF is an independent, lay-led organization founded by former presiding Bishop Henry Knox Sherrill. We're dedicated to empowering congregations and other Episcopal entities, and we do this by teaching congregations how to strengthen their leadership and their financial capacity. Now, most people know us through our online resource hub, Vital Practices, and if you know ecfvp.org, you can go to the top of your screen where you see that little icon that looks like a Fisher-Price person and raise your hand and let us know that, yes, you know about Vital Practices. We also publish vestry resource guides, and we offer a multitude of leadership training webinars, all of which are archived on Vital Practices. Look at all those people saying, yes, yes, you know about Vital Practices. That's great. Now, good leadership attracts support, I'm happy to say, and the other half of our mission is helping you manage that support. ECF's Financial Resources Division offers stewardship coaching, like this webinar, capital campaign consulting and management, endowment services. We can help you set up an endowment. We can help you manage that endowment. And we are the official planned giving arm of the Episcopal Church. You can learn more about that at our website, episcopalfoundation.org. Write it down, check it out. Now I'm going to turn the floor over to Chris. I'm going to turn off my web camera, but I'll be working behind the scenes to forward your questions to Chris. And again, if you're just joining us, feel free to type your questions into the chat log below, and we will get to them as we go along. So let me turn off my web camera, and Chris, I'm going to hand the slides over to you.
Well, great. Thank you. Thank you, Terry, for that great introduction, and thank you to everybody for being here. It's great to see so many people interested in this topic of year-round stewardship, a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. And I hope maybe together over the next hour, we might be able to talk about some ideas, and you may be able to pick up at least one or two that you can put to work in your parish or your ministry context right away. So I'm going to start off with a nasty trick that one of my law school professors did to us, and that is to give you a pop quiz in the very opening moments of the class. I haven't taught you a single thing yet, but I'm going to ask you to see if you can answer this question. What is stewardship? Is it the annual campaign? Is it B, a general term for all the ways that we fund the mission and the ministry of the church? Is it C, about making prudent decisions around the church budget? A churchy term for fundraising for all you cynics out there? Or is it E, all of the above, and or possibly F, none of the above? So go ahead and make your selections. This is a fun kind of a quiz that I like to use to kind of kick off anytime I do a class on stewardship, whether it's for a confirmation class or for the vestry, or maybe as part of an orientation for a stewardship committee. you get a range of answers, and it helps you to kind of get a sense of where folks are coming from. So I'm looking at the answers I see coming in. When you do this quiz for newcomers or at a confirmation class or something, you tend to get people trying to reason out those first three questions. So you get a lot of answers there, and then a lot of folks will choose all of the above. And I'm actually throw this out there as an intro to the idea that possibly stewardship is way more than all of this. And in fact, I'm actually going to say or suggest that maybe the answer is F, none of the above. The point being that, so it's a little bit of a trick question. I apologize for that. But so what is stewardship? If it's none of those things, what is it? Here's a definition that was given to me by Terry Parsons, the late Terry Parsons. She was the director of stewardship at 815 for a number of years, and I think it's a pretty good one. Stewardship is using the gifts we've been given to do the work God is calling us to do. So if you define stewardship in that way, if you think about it that way, stewardship really becomes the how of the Great Commandment, doesn't it? It becomes the how of how we live out our baptismal covenant, how we seek to serve Christ in others. And it becomes the response to words it's important because I think words do mean something. And if we limit the meaning of stewardship, if we continue to only use it in the context of our annual campaigns, we run the risk of losing the theology that is behind it. Imagine if we did the same thing with prayer. Imagine if prayer became defined as that thing we do in church on Sundays, for example. It would change over time how our members, how we begin to think of prayer. Prayer would become a very church-centric, a very clergy-centric experience. And so it's important to remember that stewardship is this larger, much larger concept than the way we so often use it. And of course, one of the problems with all that is we've developed a number of time-honored traditions around stewardship, not just the definition. So often we tend to think of stewardship as that painful 3-5 week period in the fall. We don't have a great way of talking about stewardship, so we tend to rely on notions of obligation or guilt. There's a number of great stewardship programs on vital practices that you might want to watch. I would encourage you to watch that really go into the details of that. But needless to say, motivating people to give out of obligation and need and guilt and those kinds of ideas really doesn't work. The other kind of bad practice I see at a lot of churches I work with is there's a kind of underlying idea that stewardship or the annual campaign is something that we want to get over quickly so we can get back to spiritual matters. Does that ring a bell with anyone? It's kind of like the idea of just bear with us for this month. We've got to get this important work. I actually had a rector say that one time in a church I was in. Let's get through this. If everybody does their fair share, we'll be able to get this thing solved and move on. And that's unfortunate because, like I said, it really doesn't work very well in terms of developing successful campaigns. And we leave a vital part of our formation off the table. When we kind of leave the stewardship formation to just that narrow definition, I think we do a disservice. So the problem is many of our congregations end up in this kind of catch-22 where we don't really have an inspiring way of talking about stewardship, but then we have all this budgetary pressure that leads us to simply talk about it in terms of budget, and it's the annual begathon, as somebody mentioned in the opening. And the other thing I would say too is it perpetuates, I think, this disconnect between our money life and our spiritual life. And I think that is well personified by this email I received a couple of years ago. I've actually received a couple of different versions of this email, but this is from a longtime member that someone sent me. Dear Chris, I wanted to let you know that I will not be able to make a pledge this year, at least not for the foreseeable future. Business has really slowed, and I won't be able to, but rest assured, as soon as things turn around, I will be happy to do so, hopefully soon. Smiley face. Then he ends with, on a happier note, I won't be around the cathedral for the next few weeks as I'm leaving for a cruise to the Mediterranean on Monday, or the Caribbean, sorry. And I'll see you all when I return in October. Peace, signed, long-term member. That was basically a real email, and it was CC'd to the dean of the cathedral, if you can imagine. So it wasn't just me. Both of us got it. And we kind of walked outside of our offices and met in the hallway and had a bit of a laugh that, wow, what an example of this complete disconnect. And like I said, I've had other emails like that over the years. One of them was involving a new car and that kind of thing. But that's really we deserve that when we don't talk about money and stewardship in the ways that I'm hopefully we're going to be covering as we go. So what's the solution? So again, it's the title of this thing, how to talk about money when we're not asking for it. We need to develop a language. One of the questions that people started off with in this seminar today was, someone asked, how do we talk about money without making people uncomfortable? And I'm going to hopefully answer that as we go. But it's an interesting question. I might even argue that people are already uncomfortable about money. When we talk about money, we're not making it an uncomfortable subject. It already is. We don't have a language for talking about money. And just think about that in our culture. Do we talk about money with our friends? Think about what we put on Facebook, right? We'll put when we're ill. We'll put when we break up. When our dog dies, we'll talk about that on Facebook. We'll put virtually anything up there. But when was the last time you saw somebody make a post about, gosh, I just missed my car payment this month, getting worried about money? You don't see those. Or does anybody recommend a good bankruptcy attorney? I'm looking for one. People keep that kind of part of our lives to ourselves, right? What is the first thing you ask somebody when you first meet them? One of the first things that is. And that is, what do you do for a living, right? That's a very common question. But we don't dare ask, how much do you make, right? That's like one of the most socially outrageous questions that you could ever ask. We don't want to talk about those topics. And that culture of inability to talk about money has filtered right over into the church. And so we're reluctant to do so. So we use terms like stewardship to talk about financial fundraising sometimes. And I think this is a culture that we need to change, and that's what we're going to try to tackle as we go. So who's our model for talking about money? I mean, if we don't want to talk about it in our culture, talk about it, who in our life talked about money? And of course, Jesus did. Jesus talked about it quite a bit. In fact, there are people on the internet, you can Google this, who are debating very, very forcefully just exactly how often he did talk about money. But suffice to say, the consensus seems to be he talked about money and stuff, depending on how you define it, probably second to, as much as anything, if not other than the kingdom of God itself. So he talked about money and stuff more often than prayer, more often than serving others. And what was the context, right? Frequently, when he talked about money, it was often it was about our attachment to things, as money or stuff as a barrier to relationship with God and each other. And of course, the story of the rich young man is a great example of that. And we should talk about money. After all, we spend about a third of our lives earning it or spending it. We spend more time earning money than we spend with our spouses and with our children and with caring for others combined. We're all working a lot, aren't we? We are working longer hours than we ever have. We have both parents in the workforce nowadays. There was a time when that wasn't the case. So we're spending all this time earning this money, but we're not spending much time really discerning what we do with it when we receive it. And of course, if we don't do that, if the church doesn't enter into this conversation, this awkward, uncomfortable conversation, I can guarantee you someone will, and that is our culture, right? Our consumer culture is very comfortable talking about money. It is estimated that your parishioners will see between 1,500 and 3,000 advertisements every single day. So that's when you add up things like TV commercials, print advertisements, internet banner ads, the ads that come through on our cell phones, radio, digital music delivery, billboards, bus stops, even our clothing, right, has advertisements. And one of the underlying messages of most ads, if you watch them with the critical eye, is they're saying something to us about ourselves. They're saying, if you want to be thin, or if you want to be beautiful, or if you want to be accepted, or if you want to be successful, or any of these kinds of things, if you want to be lovable, in a sense, then you need to buy our product. And of course, conversely, if you can't afford that product, then you're going to be none of those things. It's like we're bombarded with this kind of conditioning, and it's a very negative conditioning. And it leads to some basic cultural values that I think have just been so intertwined in our DNA that we don't even always recognize it. And that is this idea that money is related to happiness and success. Enough is never enough, and that debt is completely normal and acceptable. And of course, I can remember in college our fraternity did a lot of fundraising by basically signing up students for credit cards. And it was a simple thing. All they needed was their school ID, and they were given, I think, about a $2,500 line of credit. And you can imagine what students did with a $2,500 line of credit. We bought a lot of beer and a lot of pizza. But that was, of course, our entree into the world of debt. And we were telling people, you have to have a credit card if you're going to rent a car ever, or if you want to open up an account or whatever. It's very much a part of our culture. And there's some consequences to that. As a result, we don't really manage our money very well. These cultural values, I don't know if you know this, but 75% of your parishioners are living paycheck to paycheck. That is, they're one paycheck away from having a serious problem. That means they're living on the edge. And what's really interesting about that is there was a Marist poll a few years ago that said 55% of people don't even imagine that there's a problem with that. It's become so normal that's perfectly acceptable to them. So not having any savings means we don't have any emergency savings, which means all it takes is a little shock to the system, and suddenly we're in trouble. So you can imagine if 75% of your parishioners are in that kind of a context, it's going to be really hard to talk to them about increasing their pledge because they've got a lot of other concerns on their mind. If their job is going through some kind of reorganization of some sort, or if their spouse is having a hard time finding a new job, they're on the edge, and it's hard to be a generous giver in that context. I saw a stat the other day saying that baby boomers have an average of $50,000 in retirement savings. That's a significant problem, and that's a lot of our parishioners are baby boomers. That's about $900,000 short from probably where they ought to be in their retirement savings by this point. That means there's a huge generation of folks out there who are not going to probably fully retire in the way that we think of retirement. And of course, all of this impacts our health. Stress is the number one cause of health problems, closely followed probably by the amount of medication that we're all on to alleviate stress. I'm just going to kind of go through these. Obviously, most people are aware of the fact I did a little bit of divorce law before I did tax law. And money is at the heart of most divorces. We have a high divorce rate, and money is at the heart of it. And I would say it's the inability to talk about money as often it is money problems. And as I learned representing people with tax problems, it's really not even money problems. It's a living above our means problem caused by all those cultural values I mentioned. And I'll tell you one other thing about couples too, and it's a sad thing again, but there's a increasing number of people who don't get divorced, who probably should get divorced, but don't because they can't afford it. That's like the irony of our relationship with money. And of course, all of this gets back to probably what a lot of you are interested in this call is, well, how does this impact our attitudes about giving? You can imagine that this consumer culture we're in, this idea of debt and enough is never enough and keeping up with the Joneses and all that, it combines to create an atmosphere of scarcity, a culture of scarcity when it comes to money. So we tend to be fearful givers. If we're living paycheck to paycheck, as I mentioned earlier, it's really hard to be a joyful, generous giver, because you know that if by giving away your money, you're making your own personal situation slightly more tenuous. You need to have a lot of trust in God. When we talk about trust in God, that is a serious trust in God. It's almost, I would argue, somewhat folly. But we'll talk about how we organize our budgets as we go. And it kind of gets to an existential question, too, and that gets to the underlying theology that I think we need to reclaim, and that is, who owns who, right? If we spend so much of our time working to earn money, we are living in larger houses than ever before. We have more stuff than ever before. We went into that Great Recession, and what was the growth industry during the Great Recession? Storage units. Storage units are a growth industry. People still needing to store stuff they don't have any place for. I represented people with tax problems, people that owed the government hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases. And I would go through their financial statement, and I can't tell you how many people I saw on there. You know, they had timeshares, they had all kinds of stuff. They were paying rent to storage units to store stuff they could probably sell to pay their tax debt, or at least part of it. But at a certain point, if it's having that much impact of our lives, to the point that it's affecting our health in some cases, that it impacts our relationships, and we spend so much time accumulating it and protecting it and storing it, you know, you really ask yourself, who owns who? Are we designing our lives, or is the culture defining our life? I had a good friend in college. He always wanted to go into public service. He wanted to run for office or serve as a public servant in administration. He had a real heart for that. And I asked him a few years ago, you know, so man, when are you gonna run for something? When are you gonna get involved? And his answer to me was, you know, Chris, I got to tell you, do you know what kind of a nut I'm having to cover every month here? I couldn't afford to run for office because I couldn't afford to win. I couldn't afford to work for the public sector in any way because of the lifestyle that he had built. And I can tell you, that wasn't his plan in college. It wasn't his plan in life. It just sort of crept up on him. And I think that's true for a lot of us. I don't think the baby boomers, for example, decided they didn't want to plan for retirement. It just sort of crept up on them. And that is I think the tragedy of the church, not talking about money. So we need to develop a language for that, and that's what we're going to get into. And then the last piece I want to say is, in part of this introduction, is these aren't just life skills that we're talking about here. This is, in my opinion, learning to live within our means ends up being the doorway to this abundant life that Jesus talks about, that we preach about all the time, that we reference in our stewardship campaign themes. We're always talking about this abundant life. It begins when you live within your means. It begins when you are no longer so self-centered that you are so worried about what's coming next or what's going to happen next month. When you can live with a sense of freedom, that's the time where you can kind of turn your energies and your focus outward. You can actually begin to love and serve and explore that intersection of where our passions and our gifts and our life skills intersect with the world's needs. That's the doorway to the abundant life. And it begins with this topic that we don't want to talk about. All right. Okay, so how do we do it? I'm going to go through a couple practical ideas here. And Terry, if you see some questions coming up, fire away. But so right off the bat, I started off kind of beating up a little bit the way we do our stewardship campaigns. And some of you might be wondering, well, if we're not going to do stewardship campaigns the way we do them, how will we do them? So I just want to say a few words about how you might rethink the way you do your annual campaign before we get to this topic of year-round stewardship, because the two go hand in hand. If you're not going to talk about stewardship formation during your campaign, if you're not going to talk about church budgets exclusively during your campaign, well, what are we going to talk about? So let me just spend a few minutes on that. I'm going to bring up my slide because I don't have the right, there we go. Okay, first things first about annual campaigns. I want you to just try on here is, yes, we want to all move away from the begathon. We all hopefully get that. That's why we're on this call. But what you don't want to do, in my opinion, is you don't want to do the conversation that I just had with you in your annual campaign. In other words, don't try to put your stewardship formation, don't try to put your teachings about money and about our relationship to money and about the theology of the abundant life. Don't try to put that on the back of your annual campaign. That teaching is too important to be in the midst of what is, let's face it, a fundraising campaign. People are suspicious when it comes to money, when it comes to an ask. So if you are wrapping your pledge ask, your request for an annual pledge, if you're wrapping that up in all of this language, which may be really good teaching, it may be really good, theology, I think by and large people aren't going to get that message. They're not going to hear that message in the way you want them to hear it. I'm seeing a question here. Other percentages on how people spend their time. Yeah, I actually got that information on where people spend their time from the U.S. Bureau of Labor. So if you Google that, you'll see that same chart come up, and they've got it all broken out about how people spend their time. Very interesting, I might say. Okay. So if we're not going to do stewardship formation and stewardship teaching in our campaigns, well, what should we do? Well, I want to suggest that wonder if you might treat your stewardship campaigns as a kind of celebration, more as a time to harvest rather than a time to plant. Okay. So what is that? What do I mean by that? I guess what I mean by that is, think about your stewardship campaigns as a time to celebrate your ministry, all of the things that happened in the past year. Give some thanksgivings for the accomplishments and for the impact you had in your local community and with your parishioners. So use your campaign to celebrate your mission. And then also, I think you might consider using it as a chance to look forward. In other words, to do some vision casting for your faith community about what God might be calling St. John's or whatever to in the coming year. So it becomes more of a State of the Union kind of opportunity. It's an opportunity to sort of check in with each other. What's going on here? What is God doing in our midst? And where might we go next? So it becomes much more mission-focused. Now, and many of you will probably, and some of you maybe are of this opinion, that you need to pass out budgets and spreadsheets and bullet points about changes to the budget and how your insurance is going up or how rents are going down, and it's caused these kinds of pressures on the budget, and we need to increase by X percent. All I can say to that is if you want to talk about that stuff, and I think it's useful because there are some people out there that want to hear that, and there are, okay? Have it available, but don't make it the focus, I guess is what I would say. Make the focus dreaming. Make the focus about possibilities, about what might happen next. The other thing I might add about stewardship campaigns is try to make them fun. That may be crazy to some people, but stewardship can actually be a lot of fun when you think of it this way. Drop the fundraising part of it, drop the budget talk, and make it a community building experience. Make it a family building experience. So when I do stewardship here at the cathedral, I invite everybody. I invite newcomers, I invite families, bring your kids. I'll have parties at different times of the day, different days of the week. And we try to do themes sometimes. Somebody mentioned they did a restaurant stewardship event where they all went to a dinner at a restaurant. That's great, I've done wine tastings, cheese tastings. I've done tea parties, high tea, very Anglican. We've done rooftop jazz dances, It's a time to gather and celebrate the year that was and vision cast for the year to come. That works for us, and I would invite you to try that if you're not doing it that way. it's very rare for some of our congregations to gather and have that type of visioning and conversations with one another. And so don't lose that. Stewardship is a great opportunity to do that. I actually tell people in the announcements, if you've never been to a party before, come. Leave your checkbook at home, by the way. These aren't, fundraising parties. We're not going to be auctioning. I'm not auctioning myself off to do your laundry for the weekend. This is not a fundraising event. This is a get connected event. Yes, we talk about the in-gathering. In other words, the moment where we want to bring a pledge card forward. Yes, we pass those out. Yes, we talk about it. We are funding this mission, but I guess what I'm trying to say is the focus is on the mission. It's on what we want to do. That's what people tend to give to, okay? They give to things that are exciting. They give to things that they're emotionally invested in. They give to things that are inspiring. And your church needs to be inspiring. And if it's not inspiring, all the talk about how you're not going to make your budget, or about how you're going to have to maybe cut out bulletins because they're too expensive, or you're going to have to maybe cut someone back part-time, all that kind of talk is not going to motivate people. Because people aren't fundamentally in our churches to fund the church. They're in our churches to be inspired, to be filled with the Spirit, and to be sent out to change the world and be transformed in the process. And if you can capture that type of vision in your stewardship parties, that's what we want to go for. The money will flow, trust me, okay? What time is it? Okay, I'm going to move on here. All right, another sort of foundational idea is, and this is okay, and then this is getting to year-round stewardship. Think of this as, this is not a technique, by the way. There isn't a checklist on how to teach giving as a spiritual practice. I want to throw this out here, though, as a goal. This is a goal we should all have. We want to we want to change our cultures at our congregations into one that thinks of giving as a spiritual practice. Just like prayer, just like worship, that it's not a program. It's not an event that happens in the fall. It's not something that's done for the sake of the church, even, right? So if it's a spiritual practice, you can ask yourself, would you still give if there were no church? Would we still give if there was no need for the church to have anything? That's the question, because we want to create a culture where giving is about my need to give, not about the church's need to receive. Okay? Jesus never talked about giving in that way. There was never the parable of the finance committee, right? There was never the teaching of the church budget. It was always about how do we get money and stuff out of the way so we can be the person that God wants us to be. That's spiritual giving as a spiritual practice. That should be your goal as a culture, and as we try to change this idea of talking about stewardship. There's a wonderful book, The Spirituality of Fundraising, that's in your materials at the end by Henry Nouwen, and I do recommend that. It's a wonderful book. It's very short, very readable. Wonderful book to kind of kick off this kind of effort at your congregations if you are interested in moving in this direction. And it really gets into this idea of how we start to think about giving as a spiritual practice. Here at the Cathedral, we actually have like a rule of life that we give people. Pray daily, worship weekly, learn constantly, serve joyfully, and give generously. And so we try to weave it in right off the bat. Day one, you come into the Cathedral, you hear that giving is a spiritual practice in this place. So you want to claim that. That's part of this teach giving as a spiritual practice. Okay, you're doing, okay. Year-round, so number 3. Okay, so here's a real practical thing that you really need to do. So I'm glad to see there's a lot of folks out there with vestries gathered around this topic, because planning is a big part of this. If we're going to take year-round stewardship formation and year-round stewardship seriously, we need to get out the calendar. And there's lots of ways to do it. There's no single way. But I don't know about you, but at our here at the Cathedral, if I don't get these different stewardship teachings or book studies, which we'll talk about in a minute, if I don't get these things on the calendar, they're going to get, something else is going to come up. There's going to be another event of some sort. There'll be, the liturgy calendar grinds on. We'll be in Lent. Next thing you know, we'll be in Easter and then Christmas. The calendar will grind on. So if you have a kind of a budget or a calendar planning meeting early in the year, make sure you carve out some space for doing year-round stewardship. And there's no one way to do it. What I've given you here is just one possibility. This is roughly kind of what we try to do around here. Different times of the season, we'll talk about different aspects of stewardship. And in January, there's health and wellness, right? Taking care of our bodies, of ourselves. There's spiritual yoga going on. That's a wonderful time, right? New Year's resolutions are happening. People are trying to get in shape. So stewardship of the body. Lent is a wonderful time to talk about simpler living. Simpler living kind of being the sequel to once we learn to live within our means, well then how do we learn to live? How do we live in an abundant life where we don't get the 82-inch plasma TV or whatever? Simple living is a wonderful theme for the time of Lent. In the spring, we do a time and talent campaign, right? How many people here do a time and talent campaign, by the way? I think we actually have a poll on that, don't we, Terry? And time and talent fairs, time and talent campaigns, right? We all know what that is. It's how do we give our gifts back into service. That's an important part of stewardship. And part of the reason why, by the way, you want to do year-round stewardship is, in this way, is you want people to understand that when we talk about stewardship, we really are talking about all these other aspects. Stewardship of the planet, stewardship of our time, stewardship of our gifts, stewardship of our bodies. So it's not just about money. It's not just about us needing your money. So when we come to talk about that, when we want to fund the mission of the church, it's much more authentic. It's much more integrated with the way we talk about how we give back to God in all these different ways. So I see that a lot of folks, okay, so quite a few of you are doing a time and talent fair of some kind or a campaign. A few people are asking, what is one? You all should be doing one, okay? And let me just say a couple words about that. I've seen a lot of churches do time and talent campaigns, maybe in the spring or whatever, and they end up being kind of recruiting drives for church jobs, right? Ushers, greeters, acolytes, all that kind of thing. So they sign up for a job in the church event. Again, just like we want to talk differently about stewardship in the fall, giving to the church, in a broader context, we want to talk about giving our time, for example, in a broader context. So think about time and talent as a discernment opportunity, a time to teach about discerning for ourselves. What are our gifts? What is my mission in life? What are the things that I've experienced in my life that I could give back to others who are maybe going through a similar thing? We tend to devalue our talents, and we're here to claim as Christians don't, right? God made you as you are perfectly for a reason, and you can give back as well as anybody. It's just a matter of finding what is that thing you know, what is that talent you have, or what is that life experience you have, what is that part of your personality that allows you to engage with people in a way that maybe I couldn't, for example. So time and talent is about valuing our broad scope of our gifts, and then doing some discernment, doing listening hearts, doing thinking about how are we being called, and then how might we reorient our lives so that we can follow that call. So it's not about just doing church jobs. It's about following ministry in the world, doing something in the community. So in your resources at the back, I give you a form that we use that tries to communicate this to people, that time and talent isn't again, it's not about doing church work. It's about who are we, discerning what our gifts are, and how we put them to work in the world. That's a kind of idea for year-round stewardship. And so calendar. got off on that topic a little bit, but calendar is important. Doesn't matter when you do it, but plan it ahead. It's important because it gets buy-in. It gets buy-in from the leadership. It gets buy-in from the other parts of your church. So if you're in a larger church and you have somebody in charge of formation, they know when the next stewardship campaign is going to be. The liturgy people will know when the next stewardship teaching theme is going to come up. And so you can then integrate it into your worship life. It can be part of the prayers of the people. It can be brought, there can be a commissioning, for example, or whatever. It helps to kind of integrate your calendar and your entire lives around these different parts of doing year-round stewardship. Oh, one more thing, there's a great year-round stewardship planning matrix done by Lance Owsley, who's the he's the canon for stewardship at the Diocese of Olympia, and that's linked in your resources at the end of this program. That's also a wonderful planning tool for doing this kind of calendar work. Okay, I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on to, so year-round stewardship practices, doing some faith and finance classes. So this is the topic. This is where you can get into the nitty-gritty about money. So all of that stuff I talked about early on, all that stuff that's on our parishioners' minds that they're unable to talk about with their friends and that the church has been unwilling to talk about generally. These are resources to help you do that, to help you find a language for tackling topics of debt and budgeting and all that sort of thing. So I've used all of these. They're all good. I think obviously we would love to all have somebody in our parish who is comfortable hitting these kinds of topics. Maybe you do. Maybe you have somebody who has a passion for this work and they want to bone up on it a little bit more and kind of make it their thing. I would encourage them to do that. On the other hand, if that's just not the case in your context and time is a problem, as it is with all of us, these kinds of packaged programs can be really helpful. Freed Up Financial Living is produced by Willow Creek, which is a mega church in Chicago. It takes some translation into Episcopalianese, if you will. You know, evangelicals do a lot of proof texting, which can be a little off-putting. Dave Ramsey, same thing. He's kind of like the high school football coach of this era. He's very entertaining. The theology is a little bit different than what we're accustomed to as Episcopalians. But you can translate these things. You can pick them up and see what they're trying to teach. What they've got in there in all these programs is really good. It's really good nuts and bolts how to budget, and it's done in the context of faith, of tackling these kinds of theological and existential questions that I was mentioning earlier. So I do recommend them, and I do recommend that you make them your own. Use them as a starting point, not as an ending point, if that makes sense. Living Wisely, on the other hand, at the bottom, that is actually a program that was put together years ago by, Terry Parsons, and it is available on the Episcopal Network for Stewardship, TENS website, and I'll give you a link to that at the end. That one is done by a tried and true Episcopalian, and it's free. And so that's a good program. All of these things are good. There's other ones out there. The point is, there's a way of getting you unstuck if you're not sure how to tackle this. It's a way of picking up a program. These are turnkey kinds of things. You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to be a former tax attorney. You can pick these up. There's a leader's workbook. You know, it's all packaged and very ready to go. Check them out, and I'd be interested in hearing your feedback. Another one, I've got some DVD resources. Again, these are things you could show, movie nights. You could do a video series where you show a clip of each one of a DVD, a couple chapters each night, and do a kind of small group discussion afterwards. These are some fun ones that I've used. Maxed Out is all about debt and the impact it has on us. That one's completely secular. All of these are basically, except for the last one. What Would Jesus Buy? That one's a little bit more got some spiritual implications. Affluenza was put out by PBS, and It's a great series, a lot of fun. It's a little dated, 90s, but that one and its sequel, Escape from Affluenza, which focuses more on simpler living, those are readily adaptable to a church context because they break the ice. They open up this hard topic that we sometimes don't want to talk about, and you can't help it because people want to talk about this area of money. It's like it's bottled up within us, and I'll tell you another thing too. Doing this topic can be evangelical, believe it or not. Every time I do a class on money or on budgeting, I put it out in the community. I let the community know. I put up bulletin boards around town at community centers, advertisements, whatever, and we always get a few. I always get folks from the community taking the class. I had a Muslim one time doing a Living Wisely class. I thought that was great because these are life skills. These are valuable life skills that people aren't getting. I taught these classes. I was asked to teach a few of them in local community colleges. All right, so I'm essentially doing a church stewardship program for community colleges, and the kids loved it because it was hitting a topic that they grew up dealing with, but not really understanding a language for talking about it. You know, I took out the God references and inserted personal life mission or personal values, right? And it was a great topic. It was a great classes. So this is really good stuff. And again, if these kinds of materials help you to kind of break the ice a little bit, great for youth groups too. Have at it and watch them ahead of time, and then do your own reflection about it. What would be a good discussion question, right? That could flow from these. Book studies. Here's a number of great books. I'm not going to kind of go through these individually just for the interest of time. I do really want to point out, though, Your Money or Your Life. That is a great one, and it's so readily adaptable to small group studies. The same with Your Money and Faith. That's a great one. It has small group discussion questions after each chapter, and great ones. When you do a book study, we do them around here. Think about summer for book studies, right? There's not a lot of programming going on in the summer. And it's a great time to try them because people, the church isn't doing a lot at that time for a lot of our congregations. Summer book studies. It's a nice way of creating that kind of culture at your church during the off season, and you can incorporate it into a sermon series. For example, a congregation-wide book study. You can invite existing small groups or existing Bible study groups to join in on the conversation. So let's say you decided to, let's tackle your money or your life and have a conversation as a congregation about that. Get everybody to sign up and do it, and work it into your what comes of it. It's all part of this kind of constant drip about helping people break open this topic. Okay. Here's a number. I mentioned Episcopal Church, the Episcopal Network for Stewardship, TENS. If you're not a member of that, I would really strongly encourage you to join it if you can. If your membership is less than 100, it's only $100 to join. If it's more than that, it's $250, and a diocese can join for $1,000. And the TENS has an enormous amount of resources. I'm giving you just a few. They've got even more. And you can get on there and use those for ideas. Lots of great ideas for Advent studies, for Lent studies, that kind of thing. Good Sense is part of that Willow Creek program. They do a newsletter every month, I think, and you can pick up ideas, sermon topics, possible book studies, possible things to work into a class. Money and Faith Network is another great one. That's mostly podcasts, but it's a great way of having those kinds of things running in the car as you work on developing your own sort of language around talking about money in the church. And of course, the Episcopal Church Foundation, Vital Practices, lots of great webinars, and I'm sure more to come. Someone earlier mentioned communication, and that's one of my, in addition, okay, it doesn't have to just be classes and book studies, but see about working in stewardship, nuggets into your newsletters. into your bulletins, onto your Facebook pages, right? So if you're subscribing to some of those other resources and you get an interesting little factoid about, 75% of Americans don't have any kind of savings to speak of, that's something to talk about because that speaks to anxiety, and that you can build a little message around that. So look for ways to talk about stewardship all the time in all your communication. Do thank you messages, right? Do little spotlights on ministries. So if you've got the women's group, if your women's group has just did a little drive for something and was able to supply diapers to a program of some for homeless families, celebrate that. Celebrate that. Put that in there. So often I see churches, and I'm guilty of this too, we'll have one ask after another, right? One thing after another, all great causes, but we're not always as good as the follow-up. Okay, so what happened with that? So we raised $5,000 to buy nets for folks in the developing world to protect them from, malaria or something. Claim that. Tell them how many we did. Thank people. Thanking is a great way of talking about stewardship during the year, and we just don't do enough thanking. And of course, that gets to preaching. You got to be preaching about this. Don't save your stewardship sermons just for the annual campaign. It tends to undermine what we're trying to do here. We want to decouple our stewardship formation, tackling these topics about living within our means, tackling topics about consumerism and debt, or about our relationship with money and how that impacts our relationship with God. People want to hear that stuff, so preach it. And if you're not preaching it, ask yourself why not. Okay, ask yourself that. That's a good question. Sometimes if we haven't developed our own way of talking about money, we should examine that. What is going on with us that keeps us from doing that? And that brings us really to this last topic, which is your money autobiography. That's a great start. If you're going to get serious about this topic of money at your church, start your group, whether it's your vestry or your stewardship committee or whatever. Have them get around and write their stewardship autobiography. Are you familiar with spiritual autobiography? Sometimes a lot of churches will invite newcomers to get in groups and tell each other their spiritual journey, right? What has been their spiritual journey up until that point in their life? And it's a way of getting to know people. It's a way of getting to know yourself a little bit. It's a way of noticing how the Spirit is moving in your life. Well, our money autobiography is the same kind of thing. What was that first memory around money? What were you taught growing up about money? What were the values? What were the experiences you saw? Did your parents fight about money? What is your money personality, right? Do you see money as a means of security? Or is it more about power? Or is it a way of expressing love? Sometimes when in relationships, when we fight about money, it's not that it's that we have a different personality. We have different values when it comes to money. So my mom, who grew up with never worrying about money, couldn't give away money soon enough. She saw money as a way of expressing love, of giving gifts. She wasn't interested in planning for it. My dad, he grew up, his parents died when he was young. He lived very modestly growing up. And so for him, money was all about security. So the two of them came at the topic so wildly different. And that impacted their ability to stay together in the long run. So, Terry, are we running kind of towards the end here?
You are just on time. I'm going to start my web camera again because what we'd like to be able to do is run you all very quickly through the resource references that are at the end of the slides that should have been sent out to you before this webinar. If for some reason you did not receive these slides, worry not. You're going to get another email that gives you a link to this recording So those of you who were having trouble with the audio on your computers, it seems to have been related to the bandwidth on the computer systems. People with phones were not having audio problems. You'll be able to go back and catch whatever you missed on the recording, as well as download all these slides with the resources that Chris has been mentioning. In addition, there are some other resources coming up, a few more webinars in the coming weeks: vestry orientation, basics of endowment, communications for Episcopal leaders. I think that was Robert, who was asking about communications. Mid-March, we've got one of our campaign consultants who specializes in debt and its impact on congregations as opposed to your individual parishioners. And then leading major change, which is probably not a bad webinar to sign up for if what you're trying to do is shift the culture change in how you talk about money in your congregation. If you've got questions that didn't get answered here, by all means, shoot me an email, or my colleague, Louise Bayeto. Our email addresses are right here. But I want to give us a few more minutes. We've got about 2 or 3 now. If you've got a question for Chris that you'd like to put in the chat, by all means, please do right now. But certainly, I think we all want to look up at the top of our
hour-long monologue over here.
No, actually, people have been asking questions and talking to each other, but you were answering all the questions as they came up.
Right.
If you look at the top of your screen with that little Fisher-Price icon, you can drop it down, and there's a place for giving applause to our great guest presenter tonight. Thank you very much, Chris, for an awesome presentation.
Great. Well, it's been a real pleasure. And let's stay in the conversation. I think through vital practices and other ways, we can continue to exchange ideas.
Okay, Chris, they're asking for your contact